The heavy oak door hummed against his palm. Deep, rhythmic bass pulsed from within the fraternity house, vibrating through the wood and rattling the bones in his fingertips. Every few seconds, the door creaked open, and a wave of heat and chaotic laughter spilled out onto the porch, washing over him. Chikondi stood in the center of that threshold, his pulse drumming in his ears in time with the music. He leaned forward, the wood cool and solid under his touch. He pushed slightly, feeling the resistance of the heavy latch. The sound grew sharper, a roar of voices and clinking glass that pulled at him, demanding he step inside. He took a breath, his lungs tight, and tightened his grip on the handle. The air around him smelled of stale beer and damp grass. He stared at the dark hinge, his knuckles straining. He held his position, his hand locked on the handle, suspended in the heartbeat between staying outside and crossing the line. A sharp, white light cut through the dim porch. Chikondi flinched as his phone screen ignited, the name Thandiwe pulsing in the dark. The music behind the wood seemed to drop away, replaced by the sudden, frantic vibration of the device against his palm. He yanked his hand from the door handle as if burned. He did not look back at the house. Instead, he pivoted, his boots scuffing against the porch boards, and retreated into the deep, unlit corner near the railing. The shadows swallowed him, hiding him from the line of sight of anyone who might step out. He pressed his back against the rough siding of the house, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He swiped the screen. "Hey," he said, his voice tight, barely audible over the muffled thrum of the bass. Thandiwe did not respond with a greeting. Her breathing was jagged, audible through the static of the connection. "Chikondi, are you busy?" she asked. The tremor in her voice hit him like a physical blow. He stared at the dark pavement below the porch, his grip tightening on the phone. Thandiwe did not wait for his reassurance. She took a sharp, jagged breath that rattled through the speaker. "My cousin is here," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "The one who attends your university. He just called me." Chikondi felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white, the plastic casing digging into his palm. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice a strained rasp. He looked toward the party, his eyes darting across the lawn. He saw faces he recognized, students laughing and swaying near the entrance. Had one of them been watching him the whole time? Thandiwe paused, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "He saw you," she whispered, standing outside the house. "He said people were drinking around you." The music behind the door surged, a chaotic, rhythmic roar that suddenly felt suffocating, as if the air itself were being sucked out of the porch. Chikondi stared at the door, then down at the dark, uneven pavement. The music behind the door pulsed, a rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards and into his heels. Chikondi opened his mouth to offer a denial, to invent a reason for his presence, but the words died in his throat. The lie felt like lead in his stomach. He looked at the door handle, then shifted his gaze to the dark, uninviting pavement of the street. The pressure to maintain his facade vanished in an instant. He let his shoulders drop, the tension leaving his frame, as he finally accepted the truth of his position. "I am outside," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. The confession hung in the air, stripped of all pretense. He felt the cold night air hit his face, sharp and biting, replacing the suffocating heat of the porch. The reality of his choice settled over him, no longer hidden, no longer masked by excuses. He stood in the dark, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the impact of his own honesty. He gripped the phone, his knuckles pale in the moonlight. Thandiwe did not speak. The silence from the phone was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against his ear like a physical weight. He watched a moth flutter erratically around the porch light, its wings beating a frantic rhythm that matched his own pulse. He wanted to fill the void with excuses, to explain the proximity, to justify why he had even walked this far. But the words felt hollow before they were even spoken. He looked at the door handle, the brass cold and unyielding under his gaze. The music inside surged again, a chaotic roar that threatened to drown out his thoughts. He turned his head, staring down the dark, empty street, searching for an exit, a distraction, anything to delay the inevitable. Then, her voice cut through the static, sharp and precise, and the single word hung in the air between them like a blade. It was not a question about his location anymore. It was a demand for his identity. He stood at the threshold, the wood of the house vibrating against his back, while the street stretched out before him in the dark. He felt the pull of the party, the familiar, numbing comfort of the crowd, warring against the quiet, terrifying clarity of the woman on the line. Chikondi lowered his gaze from the door to the lawn. Scattered beer cans caught the dim light, glinting like broken glass against the grass. A few feet away, the shadows of people stumbled past, their movements erratic and blurred. He watched them with a sudden, detached clarity. He saw the way they leaned into each other, the way they moved without purpose, and he felt a sharp, stinging recognition. This was the environment he had almost stepped into. He looked back at the phone, then at the house. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. If he crossed that threshold, the life he had built with Thandiwe would not just be compromised, it would be dismantled. Every shared memory, every promise, every moment of trust they had cultivated over months would be left behind on this lawn, discarded like the trash at his feet. The weight of the potential loss was absolute. He understood then that the door was not just an entrance to a party. It was a boundary line. To step forward was to abandon everything that mattered. He stood still, the cold air grounding him, as the cost of his presence became impossible to ignore. The silence on the line was no longer a void. It was a space for a decision. Thandiwe spoke, her voice steady and devoid of judgment. Then leave. The words were not an order, but a release. They cut through the suffocating tension that had held him rooted to the porch. Chikondi felt the grip of the house loosen. He looked at the heavy oak door one last time, seeing only wood and hinges, stripped of the false promise of belonging. He let out a breath he had been holding for minutes. His hand dropped from the door handle, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. He shifted his weight, the soles of his boots scraping against the concrete porch. He took one step back, then another, moving away from the vibrating wood. The bass, which had been a roar inside his chest, began to lose its intensity. It shifted from a physical assault to a dull, rhythmic thud. He turned his back on the house entirely, facing the dark, tree-lined street. The air felt cooler here, stripped of the stale heat radiating from the party. He took a third step, his stride lengthening, and with every inch of distance gained, the chaotic noise of the house began to recede. He was a man in motion. The distance between Chikondi and the house widened with every stride. He passed under the first streetlight, his shadow stretching long and thin across the asphalt. Thandiwe remained on the line, her breathing a steady, grounding rhythm against the silence of the street. He felt the pull of the party behind him, a lingering magnetic drag on his resolve. His boots crunched rhythmically on the gravel, a sharp, repetitive sound that filled the void left by the fading music. "I did not think it would still be this hard," he confessed, his voice catching on the cold night air. He stopped for a second, his shoulders tight, fighting the urge to glance back at the flashing lights. Thandiwe did not rush him. She waited, her presence a constant anchor. "It might always be," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "But you are not the same person who walked toward that door." Chikondi stood still, listening to the wind move through the trees above. He took a deep breath, turned his face toward the dark road ahead, and kept walking. Chikondi reached the final corner of the block, where the streetlights ended, and the neighborhood deepened into shadow. He stopped. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, the frantic pace of his earlier anxiety entirely gone. He turned his head, looking back the way he had come. In the distance, the fraternity house was a cluster of flickering, chaotic light, a beacon of a life he no longer recognized as his own. The music was nothing more than a faint, rhythmic pulse, easily ignored. He watched the lights for a long moment, waiting for the familiar tug of regret or the phantom need to return. It did not come. The silence of the street was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of a passing car and the wind rustling through the leaves above. He felt the weight of his decisions settle into his stride, making his movements deliberate and sure. He was not fighting the urge to go back, because the urge had evaporated, replaced by the clarity of his own direction. He turned his gaze forward, toward the quiet, dark path that led to his home. The road ahead was unlit, but he did not need the light to know where he was going. He took the first step away from the corner, his boots striking the pavement with a firm, confident sound. He kept walking, moving steadily into the dark, leaving the noise and the past behind him. He was not just choosing a different route. He was claiming the space he had finally made for himself.